Imagine launching an invasion that seems unstoppable. Your tanks roll across the desert, your soldiers march in tight formation, and the world watches in shock as you seize a neighboring country in a matter of days. But then, just as quickly, your grand plan unravels at the first sign of real resistance. This is the story of Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in 1990, a military gamble that began with overwhelming force and ended in humiliating defeat. Saddam's decision to invade Kuwait wasn't just a spur-of-the-moment act of aggression. It was the result of a tangled web of missed signals, unchecked ambitions, and a series of catastrophic miscalculations. To truly understand why Saddam made this fateful move and why it failed so spectacularly, we need to untangle the complex political, economic, and personal motivations that drove him. Let's rewind to the aftermath of the brutal 8-year Iran-Iraq War. Iraq, under Saddam's rule, emerged battered and deeply in debt. The war had drained the country's resources, left its cities scarred, and its people exhausted. But perhaps most importantly, it left Iraq owing tens of billions of dollars to its wealthy neighbors, especially Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. Saddam expected gratitude and financial relief for having fought what he saw as a war to protect the Arab world from Iran's revolutionary zeal. Instead, he found himself isolated and under pressure to repay debts he simply couldn't afford. Kuwait, in particular, became a focal point of Saddam's frustration. Not only did Kuwait refuse to forgive Iraq's massive debts, but it also continued to pump oil at high rates, keeping global oil prices low. For Iraq, whose economy depended almost entirely on oil exports, this was a devastating blow. Every extra barrel Kuwait produced meant less revenue for Iraq, making it even harder for Saddam to rebuild his country and maintain his grip on power. But the tension didn't stop there. Saddam accused Kuwait of slant drilling, illegally siphoning oil from the Rumaila oil field that straddled the Iraq-Kuwait border. He also claimed that Kuwait was encroaching on Iraqi territory, reviving old disputes about where the border should be drawn. In Saddam's eyes, Kuwait wasn't just an ungrateful neighbor, it was actively undermining Iraq's recovery and stealing its wealth. These grievances, real or exaggerated, became the justification for a bold and dangerous move. Meanwhile, the world was changing. The Cold War was winding down, and the old certainties of superpower rivalry were fading. The Soviet Union was distracted by its own internal crises, and the United States seemed less interested in policing the Middle East. Saddam believed that the global powers were too preoccupied to intervene decisively in a regional dispute. He saw an opportunity, a window in which he could act boldly without facing the full wrath of the international community. In the weeks leading up to the invasion, Saddam even sought clarity from the United States. He met with U.S. Ambassador April Glaspie, fishing for a green light or at least a sign that America wouldn't stand in his way. The response he received was ambiguous, diplomatic language that Saddam interpreted as tacit approval or at least indifference. This muddled message emboldened him, convincing him that the risks were manageable and that the rewards would be immense. So, in the early hours of August 2, 1990, Saddam gave the order. Over 100,000 Iraqi troops surged across the border, overwhelming the small Kuwaiti military in a matter of hours. The world watched in disbelief as Kuwait City fell and the Iraqi flag was raised over government buildings. For a brief moment, it looked like Saddam had pulled off a masterstroke. He had seized a wealthy neighbor, gained control of vast oil reserves, and sent a message to the region that Iraq was a force to be reckoned with. But beneath the surface, all was not well. Most of Saddam's army was poorly trained, badly equipped, and led by officers more loyal to Saddam than to military professionalism. Many soldiers were conscripts with little motivation to fight, and the rapid advance into Kuwait masked deep weaknesses in Iraq's military machine. The initial success was built on sand. Once the element of surprise wore off, the cracks began to show. As the world reacted with outrage, Saddam dug in. He fortified positions in Kuwait, built elaborate bunkers, and issued defiant speeches, convinced that he could withstand any pressure. He ignored a series of ultimatums from the United Nations and the United States, believing that his army could hold out against whatever force the world might muster. Saddam's confidence was rooted in his experience of surviving the Iran-Iraq War, where he had faced overwhelming odds and endured. But this time, the situation was very different. The international response was swift and overwhelming. A massive coalition of countries, led by the United States, began to assemble in Saudi Arabia. Over the next several months, Operation Desert Shield transformed into Operation Desert Storm, a military buildup unlike anything the region had ever seen. Coalition forces controlled the skies, launched devastating airstrikes, and prepared for a ground assault that would shatter Iraq's static defenses. Saddam's army, dug into fixed positions, was no match for the technological superiority and coordination of the coalition. By the time the ground war began, Iraqi troops were demoralized, hungry, and exhausted. Many surrendered at the first opportunity, raising white flags rather than face certain destruction. The coalition's advance was rapid and overwhelming. Kuwait was liberated in just 100 hours of ground combat. The images of surrendering Iraqi soldiers and burning oil wells became symbols of Saddam's failed gamble. In the end, Saddam's greatest mistake wasn't simply invading Kuwait. It was believing that the world would let him get away with it. He underestimated the resolve of the international community, overestimated the strength of his own military, and misread the signals from his supposed allies. The invasion of Kuwait became a textbook example of how ambition, miscalculation, and hubris can lead to disaster on the world stage. Saddam's defeat reshaped the Middle East, set the stage for future conflicts, and left a legacy that still echoes today.